We are back after a short break. As I read the spreadsheet, I believe next we'll hear from witnesses Davis for IPA&M and Holderman for Oxy, but let me double check. Mr. Rose?
Uh, As to IPA&M, yes, Mr. Davis will testify.
Have I already made him a panelist?
Can't speak for Oxy. He's already, I think I saw his.
I got him.
Okay,
All right, you're still under oath, Mr. Davis.
okay. So
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Okay, for the board, we're talking about IPA&M Exhibit 1, which is the proposed modifications, IPA&M Exhibit 2, which is Mr. Davis's written direct testimony, and IPA&M Exhibit 10, which is Mr. Davis's rebuttal testimony. And they've already been admitted into the record. Mr. Davis, could you briefly summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony for the board?
Yes, sir. So in the spirit of trying to expedite this, I'm going to try to just hit on the points that I don't think have been covered yet by the previous parties. I believe the department, as well as Clean Air Advocates and NMOGA, covered the purpose of pneumatics, and the only thing that I really wanted to highlight there is, just the importance that pneumatic controllers have in terms of our field separation and process control. The pneumatic driven control has been utilized in the industry for many, many years. It's a tried and true technology, and most of these sites are in remote areas, and that being the reason that pneumatic control is utilized. Moving on, I wanted to start off with my summary here just on the proposed changes that IPA&M made to the rule that was put forward by the department. NMED had based roughly this proposal on Colorado Reg 7. The differences are primarily where the basis for our changes lay. NMED proposed to phase out pneumatics based on a controller count versus production. Colorado, as we've heard already, has the basis for retrofit or phase out based on percent of production. So IPA&M proposed moving toward the percent of production phase out and instead of the controller count. The other piece that we see that's missing from Colorado Reg 7 that's already been mentioned as well is the flexibility that Colorado Reg 7 had for small producers. So IPA&M is proposing to put that flexibility back in, and that flexibility was based on production, and it was based on a company statewide average production, and we feel like that's critical for relief for the smaller producers and the lower producing wells. In addition to those two changes that we proposed to encourage the use of intermittent controllers. The justification, we've already heard quite a bit about intermittent controllers. It's not a surprise. I was pretty sure this was going to be a hot topic. But I think one point that I want to highlight, and Ms. Keene highlighted this earlier, but one of the key differences on an intermittent controller is it does not continuously bleed natural gas during normal operations, but bleeds back the actuation gas after the actuation has taken place. So an intermittent controller it's very difficult, as we've already heard, to quantify a bleed rate, as these are not a continuous type bleed controller. But we feel like most of the modern controllers out there are intermittent type controllers, and in fact, based on the inventories that the NMED had in their analysis, intermittent controllers seem to make up a large count in New Mexico. And these controllers, as Mr. Meyer discussed earlier, are tied to frequency of actuation in terms of the emissions associated with them. So this was one of the other reasons that we felt that it was important to move the phase out or retrofit to percent of production. With your intermittent controllers being based on their actuation frequency, that's tied to the throughput on a vessel or the production. And so it seems to make sense to tie the two together as you phase out pneumatic gas-powered or gas-driven pneumatics based on production. You would be getting the best bang for your buck in terms of the phase out, as well as the point I believe Mr. Meyer was trying to make earlier. Intermittent controllers in and of themselves could be a reduction made as we move from the low bleed continuous. There's reductions, cost-effective reductions associated with the use of intermittent controllers. The basis for our proposed changes were really surrounding the cost effectiveness of reducing these emissions. We have concerns with the pneumatics phase out just in terms of its burden to industry, and that being associated with the somewhat small reductions that may be made to ambient ozone concentrations resulting from the reductions of VOC emissions. And so one of the things that really drive the cost effectiveness in controlling the emissions from pneumatics, as Mr. Meyer indicated earlier, is the cost of that control. One thing that I wanted to touch on, I think Mr. Myers already went through this in pretty great detail, but I just wanted to kind of summarize, instrument air installations. I think sometimes it's characterized as kind of a plug and play type retrofit, and instrument air, especially on a retrofit type application, is relatively involved. You have the design and packaging of the air package, as Mr. Myers went through, and then once that package is delivered to the site, you've got to set that air package, and you've got to set it with the appropriate setbacks from other equipment or possible emission sources on the site. And with that, then you're trenching in the air lines and power to that instrument air system. And so instrument air is quite involved in terms of the overall installation and the associated costs with it. One of the big driving factors and one of the concerns that IP&M has in terms of instrument air is access to line power. We have a limited infrastructure up here in the San Juan Basin, and wanted to touch on that a little bit. It was something that I outlined in my rebuttal testimony. But again, access to line power is something that we believe is necessary for the installation of instrument air. And the engagement that we've had with some outside consultants, gave us some general costs associated with installing power. Average line drop costs that we were given are anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000. and that includes the transformer bank and switches. And then we have a distribution network build out cost that runs somewhere in the $300,000 to $325,000 per mile, and terrain being one of the most significant factors in terms of getting line power to where it's needed. One thing that I wanted to mention in terms of line power is, utility providers operate in what I've heard termed as the just-in-time development manner, meaning that, they do not run with excess capacity or infrastructure deployed. They, even though we may see power lines running next to a site, that doesn't mean that there's available power on that line. It would take additional capacity and infrastructure installations to actually get line power to these sites. The other issue with line power that we see is right-of-way acquisition, specifically up here in the San Juan Basin. Towards the southern part of the basin, we have kind of a checkerboard land surface ownership situation. So securing right-of-way for power lines can be a challenge. You could be dealing with multiple entities. You've got the Bureau of Land Management, the State Land Office, you've got tribal lands as well as private. So securing right-of-way can be a challenge. So the other piece that I wanted to touch on is, based on NMED's proposal, they evaluated two control technologies associated with reducing emissions from pneumatic controllers. The other one was a solar electric type installation. And what I want to focus my discussion on here is primarily my experience regarding solar electric. The point that I want to start off with is there are two primary types of actuators that are common in the oil and gas industry in terms of electric actuators. And we've got rotary electric and linear. Rotary electric are less costly, but they have their drawbacks. As Mr. Myers talked about earlier, when we're looking at a facility, we have to look at what our process response time is. Rotary electric tend to have a slower response time. And my experience here, we deployed some all electric separators up here in the San Juan Basin that had rotary electric dump valves for moving fluids from the separator to the tank. And what we found was it took a lot of fine tuning with that rotary electric to get it to where we weren't leaving the dump valve open too long, because ultimately it was sending more gas to our tanks. And so we found that, in some instances, the increased emissions at the tank were more than what we had offset with the conversion to the solar electric system. And then as we concluded that pilot up here in the San Juan Basin, the linear actuators were just starting to become available in a reasonable cost fashion. Linear actuators can provide that response time that's necessary. The issue that we see with those is their power consumption. Again, trying to match our process control times, those linear actuators can be relatively power intensive. And just recently I had one of them quoted, and the vendor up here in the San Juan Basin said that he's not aware of any operator in the San Juan Basin utilizing those that don't have access to line power, that they are not, from his understanding, they're not suitable for use with solar installations. I apologize, I'm jumping a lot long here. I've tried to mark off what's already been covered. We dove into the emission factors regarding intermittent controllers. And I think for the most part, that was covered pretty well. I just wanted to highlight the fact that IPNM, testified that we felt like the 13.5 was based on an outdated emission factor from the EPA, and that EPA study that was used to develop that factor had a small number of measurements that was taken, and that was done, I believe, over 25 years ago. And we believe there's more recent studies that have hundreds of measurements that show that the intermittent controllers are anywhere between 0.32 standard cubic feet per hour to 2.2 standard cubic feet per hour. And again, assuming that they're properly functioning. And then we also noted that Colorado Air Quality Commission recently utilized the 3.5 standard cubic feet per hour. And so one thing, and I'll touch on this later, when I say properly functioning, I am acknowledging that there are malfunctions associated with intermittent controllers, but we do believe those can be addressed through the proper monitoring programs. So one thing that I wanted to touch on in this is regarding the current structure that the NMED has put forward. There are two off ramps in the current proposal. 122B4 6 has the cost-effective off ramp. This was discussed earlier, where if an operator retrofits 65% of their entire controller count by 2027, they may submit a cost analysis to the department showing that the remaining controllers are not cost effective to retrofit. And we do appreciate this. The other off ramp in there is 122B4 Roman numeral 5. Where an operator, if they achieve 75% of their fleet in terms of retrofitting by 2025, that's as far as they have to go. Again, very appreciative of these off ramps. The concerns that we have is this doesn't give the necessary relief for smaller operators. By the time you get to both of these, you've had to retrofit 65 to 75% of your entire pneumatic controller fleet. And so to me, this recognizes this is the department's recognition that there are some controllers out there that may not be cost effective to retrofit. And we're just concerned that this does not account for those smaller operators where their entire portfolio may be marginal wells or stripper wells. So that's another reason that we have put forward our modification to incorporate the relief that Colorado Reg 7 has. And our biggest concern here is, without that appropriate relief, you've got the premature plugging and abandonment of thousands of wells in the state. And that has its associated negative impact on the local communities in terms of lost jobs, royalty, and tax revenue. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Colorado Reg 7. I mentioned earlier that the relief that is spelled out in Colorado Reg 7 is a company statewide average daily production. So it's not a blanket exemption. It's a company that can prove that their statewide average daily production is less than 15 BOE. And I believe this strikes a good balance here to provide relief for those smaller operators, again, that may find that their portfolio is primarily stripper wells. This would provide the necessary relief where they're not having to go through and retrofit wells or pneumatic controllers that are not cost effective to do so. So I would say at this point, I'm going to be moving into my rebuttal or sir rebuttal. Is that okay, Lou?
Yes, go ahead in response to, um, first, did you review the rebuttal testimony provided by the other parties on this topic?
Yes, I did.
And did you hear the testimony given earlier today from the department, from the Clean Air Advocates and from the MOGA on this topic as well?
Yes, sir, I did.
And do you have any comments on that testimony, and did it change any of your proposals before the board?
I've got a couple comments there. I would say that overall, you know, our primary concern here was trying to strike a balance with relief for those smaller producers. So that hasn't changed. I do recognize that New Mexico needs to do what's best for New Mexico. You know, basing the phase out on percent of production may not be the best approach. We felt like it was because it aligned with the use of intermittent controllers and then being their emissions being associated with the production levels. But I would say overall, you know, whether we phase out pneumatic controllers on controller count or percent of production, we primarily want to see some relief for those smaller operators. And I wanted to kind of walk through some of the rebuttal testimony and the testimony that that was presented today and kind of a response to that. So the first part, you know, we talked or we heard from the department and just looking at their rebuttal testimony. And just for the benefit of others, I'm referring to the department's rebuttal testimony 1, and I believe it's on page 85. The department stated the department also chose a different approach to addressing economic impacts on small operators in Colorado. Rather than exempting producing wells from regulatory requirements as Reg 7 does, NMED proposed a scaled back regulatory requirement to provide relief to small operators. I wanted to respond to this because this ties back to what I testified on earlier in terms of the small business. We struggled to try to come up with the appropriate relief, and one of our initial approach was to try to focus on getting the appropriate relief in the individual provisions. And I think this is a great example of that, where we believe the appropriate relief would be here in pneumatics and being able to exempt those companies as Colorado did in terms of their company statewide average daily production being less than 15 barrels of oil per day. Because that comes back to, you know, a company doesn't necessarily make decisions on a, you know, company-wide revenue basis, but more so on an individual well basis. And so when you're looking at pneumatics, it has a significant upfront cost of compliance and has the potential to burden a lot of these stripper wells. And having that specific relief for those wells, we think is important because those decisions, again, are made on an individual well basis, not necessarily the company gross revenue basis. Moving on, I believe it was EDF in their rebuttal, and I apologize, I don't have the witness noted here, but it's Exhibit XX, page 55. And the acknowledgement here was that they agreed with me in my direct testimony about properly functioning intermittent controllers being less than the 3.5 standard cubic feet per hour. However, they noted that malfunctioning intermittent controllers can emit significantly more. And then they also reference that as why EDF has proposed that New Mexico require operators periodically inspect controllers during LDAR inspections. My initial response to this was, we've got AVO requirements, both from the Oil Conservation Division as well as what is proposed here by the NMED. But I would say that industry is supportive of doing leak detection and repair on our pneumatic controllers. And, if that eliminates that concern, I think that's a win-win. We've got a method to secure reductions in terms of encouraging the use of intermittent controllers while ensuring that they're properly functioning through the proper monitoring protocols. Moving on to Clean Air Advocates, Dr. McCabe, it's Exhibit 23. Not going to read the entire testimony here, just summarize it, but my understanding from Dr. McCabe's testimony here was he was highlighting why the Colorado Reg 7 exemption for small producers isn't applicable in New Mexico. And he states that in Colorado, there were 187 operators that were below the 15 barrels of oil equivalent. And gives the well count at 15,411 wells, and that is 30% of the total well count in Colorado. And then further goes on to show that in New Mexico, there are an estimated 312 firms that produce less than the 15 BOE per well per day in New Mexico. And they operate an associated 32,000 wells, which he showed to be 57% of the total well count in New Mexico. And I agree with the numbers that he's put forward. I ran similar numbers and they're in the same ballpark here. I just disagree with his conclusion that it's not appropriate in New Mexico. I believe that these numbers show that it is very appropriate, that we have 32,000 wells here that are in need of relief, and without the proper balance of relief and the provision, those wells stand to be prematurely plugged and abandoned. And again, as I mentioned, this has a very negative impact to our local communities in which we operate: loss of jobs, tax and royalty revenue. One of the other things that I wanted to address in Sir rebuttal here is the discussion that we just kind of moved out of in terms of the gas captured and sold. I did a quick calculation just based on the 3.5 standard cubic feet per hour and came up with 0.084 MCF per day. And for everybody's benefit, MCF is 1,000 cubic feet. That's the metric that we use to quantify gas production. But if you multiply that out over an entire year, that would be 30 MCF per year per device. And if you multiply that volume by $5, just to make the math easy, that's $150 a year. And I think the point to be made here is, I mean, we're in the business, especially if we're operating a gas well, of capturing and selling every bit of product that we can. The point here is it's a very small volume. I took that and just compared it to the upfront cost of a solar electric actuator, and that's less than 4% of the cost of that actuator. And in terms of an instrument air installation, assuming that an instrument air system, and this is kind of based on my experience, would service 20 devices, that comes up to be about 12 grand a year, which is a significant amount of money. But when you compare that to the cost of just the instrument air skid, not necessarily installation or anything of that nature, that's 3% of that cost. So again, one of our primary concerns, with the rule as it has been proposed is it's got a high cost of compliance, and we believe that there needs to be necessary relief for smaller operators. Ms. Keene today mentioned that no other party had set out their clear proposal or justification. And I just wanted to respond to that. I felt like IPNM was clear that there is a need, to have the appropriate flexibility in the regulation. And we believe that that was, or could be achieved with the phase out of pneumatic controllers based on production, coupled with the use of intermittent bleed controllers, and including that low producer exemption. That provides the best balance in terms of flexibility. And again, that's based on the fact that intermittent controllers are prevalent in the state based on the EPA greenhouse gas reporting data, and that intermittent bleed emissions are based on actuation frequency, which is dependent upon production volume. So Lou, I believe that's all I have.
Okay, Madam Hearing Officer, Mr. Davis is available for questioning.
Thank you very much. Other parties or council with questions of Mr. Davis, please turn on your camera. I'm not seeing anyone. I'll turn to questions from the board while I'm doing that. If you're an attendee on this site, please reach out through the chat with any questions. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I don't have any questions at this point.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trio Davis.
Thank you. I just have a couple of quick follow-up questions. Mr. Davis, you said something kind of interesting about the BOE versus revenue for the small businesses. Can you, first of all, can you help out the board by explaining BOE, and then maybe kind of just go into that a little further? I thought that was an interesting concept.
Yeah, so I apologize. I tend to use acronyms there and forget that folks may not know what I'm talking about. BOE is barrel of oil equivalent. And so we tend to roll up natural gas into an oil energy equivalent. So by MMBTU equivalent, the conversion is 5.7, I believe. A lot of times folks use 6, but you're rolling up gas and making it equivalent to the same volume of oil. So we use that measure just so we're looking at both production streams, but you've got one measure to look at. Does that clarify that? And then I think you're, sorry.
Oh, I was saying, yes, that does make sense.
And then I believe you asked me to explain a little more on the exemption based on, or the flexibility based on the 15 BOE versus gross revenue.
Yes, it sounds like if a company has mostly stripper wells or marginal wells in our portfolio, that their BOE would be less maybe, and therefore it was a different metric for judging a small business.
Yeah, so I would say that's kind of a national standard in terms of defining, and these terms get intermixed in terms of marginal or stripper well, but the stripper well kind of cutoff is that 15 barrels of oil equivalent. And, I feel that that's a better measure. Most wells below that 15 barrels of oil equivalent are marginal in nature. So they when I say marginal, I mean they don't have enough margin in terms of, the gross revenue to the expenses that it takes to operate them to comply or to, have excess cash flow for cost of compliance. And so, and basing it on production versus gross revenue, production's production, it's publicly available. It's not going to fluctuate with commodity prices, though commodity prices do impact the profitability or the margin of a well's production. It's a very consistent, publicly available metric that can be used to identify wells that may have concerns of being overburdened by cost of compliance.
Do you currently report your BOE volumes to OCD or to NMED?
We do not. we report barrels of oil and our volume of gas produced, but not BOE.
Okay, and my last question is more of just a infrastructure question. And actually, I appreciate you talking about the power infrastructure earlier. That was one of my questions earlier in the day. But when you're talking about these stripper wells and modifications to them, I've noticed that a lot of stripper wells have older equipment on them. Are there any challenges with retrofitting the equipment on those older wells versus the newer wells?
In some cases, in terms of pneumatics, one thing that my company went through back in, I believe, 2011, somewhere around there, we went through and eliminated all of our high bleed pneumatic devices. And Wellmark actually makes a conversion to take a continuous bleed, high bleed Wellmark controller and turn it into an intermittent bleed using a miser valve. I apologize, probably getting too technical, but I think this answers your question. The more modern pneumatic controllers, we were able to easily retrofit. The older equipment, there were some challenges in terms of trying to retrofit those. In a lot of instances, we had to replace the entire controller. It wasn't an easy conversion to go from, say, a high bleed to an intermittent bleed or a low bleed. But across the board within this rule, I would say that is always the case. Storage tanks is one place that we have concerns where an older tank may not be able to hold the necessary pressure rating for vapor recovery or controls. It's an older tank. It wasn't designed, or it wasn't necessarily manufactured to the current specs, and may have challenges being vapor tight in terms of being able to operate at those higher pressures necessary for vapor recovery.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions I have for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Kate.
Yeah, no questions here. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Bitzer.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia.
Yes, thank you. One question, Mr. Davis. I think you said that the Colorado Rule 7 that had the cutoff of less than 15 BOE per day, and 15 BOE per day is basically the definition of a marginal well, right?
Correct.
Could you tell me approximately what percentage of the wells in your area are marginal? I know this varies from year to year, but can you give me a ballpark percentage of the wells that are marginal in the San Juan Basin?
Mr. Davis, we seem to have lost your video. You can certainly turn it off if it's uneven. Let's see here.
Planning
See if
hearing
I can-
officer, can you hear me?
Yes, I just turned off your video. There. Can you hear me? Okay, Mr. Davis is unmuted, but is clearly having a technological challenge.
Madam Hearing Officer, he's going to be around, so if we need to put him back on, if the technology doesn't seem to work here shortly, we certainly be willing to put him back on to answer Board Member Garcia's questions.
All right. Well, I'm sorry, Member Garcia, we're not getting him back right away. He's definitely unmuted and his video's off, so I'm not sure what to do. All right. And is that you, Mr. Davis? No. All right. Mr. Jano, I see you on the screen. If we move now to Mr. Holderman, does that work?
Sure does, Madam Hearing Officer. Good afternoon. Mr. Holderman's testimony for the board is at Oxy Exhibit 2 and Oxy Rebuttal Exhibit 2, where we'll cover Mr. Holderman's direct rebuttal, and in this instance, he does have SIR rebuttal. And consistent with our desire to move things along, we propose doing all of those together. Mr. Holderman has 3 issues on direct and rebuttal. They are, first, an agreed compliance schedule that Oxy and the environmental groups have proposed. This is the table you've heard reference to before. Secondly, an exemption for wellhead-only artificial lift facilities. And then third, an agreed clarification with the environmental groups that certain monitoring results are not evidence of non-compliance when companies find and fix those issues. I will turn it over here to Mr. Holderman for direct and rebuttal, and SIR rebuttal after.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Holderman. Give you a second to get situated there.
Thanks.
Could you please summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony for the board?
Yes. First, as originally drafted, the proposed rule includes a compliance schedule that requires a certain percentage of pneumatic controllers and pumps to be in compliance by a specific date. NMED's suggested approach creates more of a burden for NMED and operators because it relies on controller count rather than, we find that historic liquids production should be the basis for the requirement. Oxy USA suggests that basing the compliance timeline for pneumatic controllers on historic liquids production, as opposed to the number of pneumatic controllers at a site, for example, requiring that the pneumatic controllers with highest historic liquids production be addressed first, would better ensure that the pneumatic controllers that are actuated most frequently and therefore have the potential to emit more often are retrofitted first. Oxy USA encourages the department to adopt the language in Exhibit 1 to my rebuttal testimony, which includes a modified implementation schedule with more reasonable timelines that incorporate elements of Oxy USA's, EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA's initial proposals presented in direct testimony and addresses the parties' implementation concerns. Oxy USA believes this proposal is workable for Oxy USA's New Mexico operations, but I'm not saying whether they're feasible for other operators in the state. I can only speak for Oxy USA's individual position. Second, Oxy USA requests that artificial lifts located on wellhead-only facilities be exempt from the requirement to retrofit with access to commercial line electric power, which allows operators to focus resources to retrofit larger producing locations and would result in the greatest emissions reduction. The requirement in the proposed rule to retrofit existing pneumatic controllers with access to commercial line electric power is problematic for artificial lift controllers located on wellhead-only facilities. Wellhead-only facilities do not contain other production or processing equipment and are often in remote areas. It's not always logistically feasible to electrify these locations due to issues outside of Oxy USA's control, including right-of-way acquisition issues, distance from line power, and the capacity to electrify a facility. Even without the foregoing concerns, the cost and time can be prohibitive. The cost to run an electrical line in southeast New Mexico to a facility around $200,000 per mile, and with lead times up to a year present. Third, as noted in my rebuttal testimony, Oxy USA understands the addition to Section 22C advocated by EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA that applies the monitoring requirements of Section 116 to pneumatic controllers. The department's September 16th version of the rule also includes this requirement. Oxy USA supports this addition, but believes it's necessary to add language to clarify that detectable emissions should not trigger enforcement if the owner or operator properly addresses any findings. Oxy USA believes this clarification is necessary because optical gas imaging and Method 21 inspections cannot quantify emission rates. EDF, Clean Air Advocates, and NAVA has supported this additional language in their rebuttal proposals, and Oxy USA appreciates their.
Mr. Holdeman, does this conclude your direct rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it does.
And did you have a chance to review the rebuttal testimony presented by other parties?
I did.
Were you listening today to the testimony earlier?
Yes, I was.
And do you have any rebuttal points you'd like to raise?
I do.
What are those points?
The department's September 16th proposal establishes a 2-year timeline to complete retrofits for existing controllers with access to commercial line power and allows for pneumatic controllers with a greater than zero bleed rate in certain circumstances. Oxy USA appreciates these updates, but has concerns with proposals by other groups that would first set a much shorter timeline of 6 months for retrofits of existing controllers with access to commercial line power. And second, would adjust the bleed rate threshold to 0 for certain requirements in Section 122. The proposed timeline of 6 months to complete a retrofit for existing pneumatic controllers is unrealistic and does not account for the time needed for engineering design, securing the necessary parts, and completing the retrofit operations. Second, as it concerns bleed rates, Oxy USA disagrees with proposals to adjust the bleed rate threshold for several requirements in Section 122 from 6 SCF to 0 SCF. It is impractical and unnecessary to impose a bleed rate on all pneumatic.
Does that conclude your rebuttal testimony?
It does.
Mr. Holdeman's available for cross-examination.
Thank you very much. If there's another party or party representative with questions of Mr. Holderman, Mr. Heiser?
Hi, Mr. Holderman. I'm Eric Heiser, representing the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. I just wanted to confirm that I had heard you say that Oxy had encountered lead times of over or up to a year in southeastern New Mexico and trying to arrange for line power. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Other party or council? Ms. Gutierrez?
Thank you very much, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Holdeman, good to meet you virtually. I have just a quick question. I understood you to say that you evaluated these alternative pneumatic proposals as it relates to Oxy USA's operations only. Is that right?
That's correct.
And does Oxy USA operate any transmission compressor stations in the state of New Mexico, as that term is defined in the proposed rules?
We do not.
Okay, so it's safe to say that your analysis and any support of the alternate proposals didn't consider transmission compressor stations.
That's correct.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Any other council or party with questions of Mr. Holderman? No? I will turn to the board for their questions. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee on this platform and have a question, please reach out through the chat. Madam Chair?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I don't have any questions of this witness. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis?
I don't have any questions either. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Member Cates?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions, thank you.
All right. Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
And Member Honker?
No questions, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Any follow-up, Mr. Jano?
No, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Holderman. and Mr. Jano. Do I understand now that we move to Mr. Carr for GCA?
Madam Hearing Officer, I believe Mr. Davis is available if you want to complete his questioning by Board Member Garcia. Problem I guess he had when he got cut off was when he joined, he wasn't a panelist, so you
I've-
couldn't hear him and he couldn't hear you.
I've made him a panelist now, so thank you very much. Mr. Davis, you're back on screen. Member Garcia, would you please repeat your question? Oops.
Now she's
So my question was, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question was, you were interested in the Rule 7 in Colorado with their cutoff of less than 15 BOE per day. So I'm wondering, in New Mexico, could you give me a rough idea of what percentage of the wells in the San Juan Basin are marginal or stripper wells? And I realize this changes from year to year, but generally speaking, can you give me a ballpark?
I would say that it probably follows to some degree what the average is across the state, probably a little bit higher. So I would say 65% of the wells in San Juan are stripper wells.
Great, that's exactly what I needed. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That's all.
Thank you. Member Honker?
No questions, thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Rose, will there be any follow-up with Mr. Davis?
I have no redirect.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. We'll
Thank
excuse
you.
you for now. And Mr. Boutier, I see you on screen. Will we be hearing from Mr. Carr next?
Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer, Madam Chair, members of the board. The Gas Compressor Association offered advanced written testimony from two technical witnesses on the subject of pneumatic controller requirements in section 122 of NMED's proposed rule. Those witnesses are Mr. Raymond Carr of FW Murphy Production Control and Mark Davis of JW Power Company. And their testimony appears as GCA Exhibits 17 and 32 respectively. In essence, they propose changes to section 122 that would encourage and look more favorably upon the continued employment of intermittent pneumatic controllers than what was originally proposed by NMED. The GCA offered its viewpoint that intermittent pneumatic controllers should be considered part of the emission reduction goals solution, particularly in remote applications. However, NMED did not accept GCA's proposed changes in its September 16 draft, and other industry commenters are pursuing a slightly different approach to lessen the technological and cost burdens associated with that section of the proposed rule. The GCA has decided not to further pursue testimony on its proposed changes to section 122 today. We'll defer to the oil and gas associations on the pneumatics issues and is committed to working with its customers to comply with the pneumatic controller requirements that the board adopts as a final rule. Accordingly, the GCA will not be offering oral testimony from Mr. Carr and Mr. Davis, but it does offer to make them available as a panel if any party or board member is inclined for any reason to ask questions of them.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Boutier. If you are a party representative or counsel and would have questions, were Mr. Carr and Mr. Davis to present themselves, please turn on your camera. I'm seeing no one, Mr. Boutier. Board members, perhaps wave a hand if you would have questions of that panel. I'm seeing no hands, Mr. Boutier. All right, well, thank you very much for being clear about about your journey to this point, and we'll thank Mr. Carr and Mr. Davis for their willingness to testify. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. Do I understand then that we would be moving to EDF and witnesses Lyon and Alexander, although I seem to remember Mr. Alexander wasn't available till Friday. Ms. Paraños? Oh, there you are.
Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer. I'm just confirming that David Lyon is on, and yes, we are.
Yes, I'm
on. Perfect. Oh, there he is. Mr. Alexander until later this week.
All right, thank you. And I think I already swore Mr. Lyon. Yes? No? Okay.
No.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lyon, if you would spell your name for the record, please.
Yes, DAVIDLYON.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I swear, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. David, can you please tell the board where you are employed?
Yes, I'm a senior scientist at Environmental Defense Fund, where I work on approaches to measure and reduce oil and gas methane emissions.
And what is your educational background?
Yes, I have a PhD in environmental dynamics from the University of Arkansas, and my dissertation was on oil and gas methane emissions.
And can you please provide an overview of your work experience?
Yes, I worked at EDF for over 9 years and co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed papers on oil and gas emissions. And prior to my work at EDF, I worked at the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality, where I was the manager of the state's air pollution emissions inventory program. And at the agency, I led an EPA-funded project to develop an emission inventory and measure air pollution from natural gas facilities in the Fayetteville Shale of Arkansas.
Thank you. And is EDF's Exhibit B an accurate copy of your CV?
Yes.
And did you submit direct and rebuttal testimony on behalf of EDF in this matter?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to your file direct or rebuttal testimony on section 122, which is the pneumatics provisions?
No.
And do you adopt your written direct and rebuttal testimony regarding pneumatic controllers here today?
Yes, my written testimony is EDF Exhibit RR, and the rebuttal testimony is Exhibit XX, and I'll be discussing papers that are Exhibits J, L, M, N, O, VD, and AAA.
Thank you. Madam Hearing Officer, I would move to admit Dr. Lyon's direct and rebuttal testimony and the exhibits he just noted, subject to the objections that have been raised by NMOGA and IPANM.
Right. So we can certainly admit them subject to those objections, which I think we'll be discussing tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lyon, could you please provide a summary of your opinions regarding pneumatic controllers?
Yes, so first we propose that gas-powered pneumatic controllers are included in leak detection and repair programs. So NMED accepted this proposal in its September 16th draft, section 122C4, and we appreciate the adoption of this proposal as peer-reviewed studies demonstrate that malfunctioning gas-powered pneumatic controllers can prevent significant VOC and methane emissions. In addition, this requirement tracks a similar rule promulgated by the state of Colorado's Air Quality Control Commission. And we believe this requirement will help reduce emissions from malfunctioning gas-powered pneumatic controllers. Second, and importantly, as discussed by Dr. McCabe this morning, the best and surest way to reduce emissions from malfunctioning pneumatic controllers is to replace them with zero-emitting devices, as EDF and others have proposed. Inspections will help minimize emissions from malfunctioning gas-powered pneumatic controllers, but they will not eliminate these emissions. So replacing gas-powered pneumatic controllers with zero-emitting controllers will eliminate the emissions from both properly operating and malfunctioning controllers.
Thank you. And did your direct testimony describe studies that found significant emissions from malfunctioning gas-powered pneumatic controllers?
Yes.
Can you please summarize for the board the findings from those studies?
Yes, so the first study is Exhibit J, Allen et al. 2015. So this was a study led by the University of Texas and sponsored by Environmental Defense Fund. that measured methane emissions from 377 pneumatic controllers throughout the United States at production sites. And this study found that the average emission rate was 5.5 standard cubic feet of gas per hour. In the study, they had industry experts review the emission patterns of the 40 highest emitting controllers, which were responsible for about 80% of the total measured emissions. And the experts concluded that 28 of these 40 highest emitting controllers were malfunctioning and operating in a manner inconsistent with the manufacturer's design. And the study also found that many devices, which are designed to only emit during actuation, so intermittently emitter controllers that should have zero emissions between actuations, some of them were having malfunctions that caused them to emit continuously.
Dr. Lyon, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you please slow down just a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.
So
please continue.
The second study is Exhibit M, which is the City of Fort Worth Natural Gas Air Quality Study. And in this study, contractors measured emissions from 489 intermittent pneumatic controllers. They detected the emissions using infrared cameras and then used method 21 and high flow samplers to quantify emissions of controllers. And they found that many of these pneumatic controllers were having high emissions, often due to malfunctions. And the emission rate of some of these controllers, the average emission rate of pneumatic controllers in the Fort Worth study were approaching that rate of high bleed controllers. And the study authors found that a lot of this was due to malfunctions of controllers. The third study, Exhibit N, is the Precursor study of pneumatic controller emissions in the Canadian province of British Columbia. And this study also noted that a lot of maintenance issues led to abnormally high emission rates. And the researchers could not identify the cause of these emission rates, but these findings are consistent that often issues with pneumatic controllers cause abnormally high emissions. And then finally, Exhibit O, the carbon limits report also confirms that pneumatic controllers often have excess emission rates due to malfunctions.
Thank you so much. And so in your opinion, do these studies support EDF's proposal to require operators replace gas-powered pneumatic controllers more quickly than the department has proposed?
Yes, they do.
Thank you so much. Now I'm just going to move to one cert rebuttal question. Dr. Lyon, we heard testimony earlier today, as well as in NMOGA's opening statement, that suggested that AVO inspections, audio, visual, olfactory inspections, can detect leaks from malfunctioning pneumatic controllers. In your opinion, are AVO inspections as reliable in detecting emissions from malfunctioning pneumatic controllers as optical gas imaging cameras or other instruments?
No, AVO is not as effective as OGI or other instruments. So I've heard from industry experts that occasionally AVO does work for finding malfunctions, including malfunctioning pneumatics, but that the really success rate of AVO is highly dependent on conditions in the field, such as the weather conditions and other sources. So for example, if there's other sources on site or there's other large or loud emission sources such as flares, often the operators are unable to detect the malfunction through listening or seeing.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCabe, and this concludes his summary.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. Let me pause for a moment in the event another party or lawyer has questions. Let's see. Mr. Heiser's screen has gone on.
Yes, this is Mr. Curtis. Yeah, I pop in from time to time. Sorry. Yeah, I just had a few questions for Mr. Lyon. Mr. Lyon, I apologize on behalf of all of us that you have to hang out with lawyers today. I can't imagine that's very much fun, but appreciate you being here and sharing with us your expertise. I had just a few questions on some of the testimony that you provided. You spoke a little bit about Exhibit J, which I believe is entitled Methane Emissions from Process Equipment at Natural Gas Production Sites in the United States. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, great. I wanted to talk a little bit about a statement that you made in your rebuttal testimony, where you state that, quote,
a properly functioning intermittent controller emits less than 13.5 standard cubic feet per hour. However, malfunctioning intermittent controllers can emit significantly more than this amount and significantly more than a properly functioning continuous bleed controller. So your testimony is basically that while properly functioning intermittent controllers emit less than 13.5, the 13.5 is nevertheless appropriate to account for malfunctions. Is that your testimony?
No, I did not provide a number that's appropriate, just that the well-functioning operational pneumatic controllers is less than 13, and the average for all malfunctioning pneumatic controllers is above 13. I believe it's close to about 40 SCF per hour based on that study.
Okay. And so this study actually found for intermittent controllers that the average rate of intermittent controllers was 2.2 standard cubic feet per hour. Do you agree?
If I'm remembering correctly, that was the average of the controllers that the operators told the study partners were intermittent controllers. It was not based on the actual emissions pattern of those controllers.
And are you familiar with follow-up work that was conducted by Dr. McCabe to evaluate the impact of that characterization might have introduced, the bias that might have introduced?
I'm familiar with some of Dr. McCabe's work. Not exactly sure which analysis you're talking about, though.
Okay. Have you reviewed Mr. Meyer's testimony, direct testimony, and any related appendices associated with that? In particular, a letter provided by Dr. McCabe in 2015 responding to this particular study?
I have not read that letter, but I think if it's the analysis I'm remembering, I was involved with the analysis with Dr. McCabe at that time period.
And wasn't the purpose of this analysis to adjust the 2.2 standard cubic feet per hour to account for any bias that may have been introduced by not including malfunctioning intermittents as intermittents?
Yeah, I believe the purpose was to calculate the emission factors based on the observed emission profiles of those pneumatics.
And specifically to include the malfunctioning components?
Yes, I believe so, both to try to come up with a combined factor and then separate factors. Yes.
And wasn't the recommendation based on that revised analysis that the appropriate emission factor based on that study was 3.5 standard cubic feet per hour?
I don't recall the exact number, but that seems reasonable. Yeah.
And to your knowledge, isn't that the emission factor that ERG has relied on and Valor and Adam Meyer have relied on as well in their analysis?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Thank you. Just a few other questions here. So part of the proposal that you've endorsed with pneumatics is to propose a more accelerated phase out. Mr. Lyon, Dr. Lyon, have you considered whether this would create any supply chain bottlenecks or similar issues?
No, I have not considered that.
Okay. And again, in the pneumatics proposal you've endorsed, the parties call for a more accelerated phase out of pneumatics. Wouldn't conducting LDAR on pneumatics mitigate the need for the accelerated schedule of retrofitting pneumatics that NMED has proposed?
So doing inspections on pneumatic controllers would eliminate the emissions from the malfunctioning controllers, but you would still have the emissions from the operational controllers. So the accelerated retrofits would reduce emissions faster from those operational controllers.
But you agree fundamentally that LDAR will identify malfunctioning pneumatics and allow repair of those leaks?
Yes, if implemented properly, then yes, LDAR of pneumatics could reduce emissions from malfunctioning pneumatic controllers.
And last question, do you dispute Mr. Morris and Mr. McNally's testimony that VOC reductions, such as reductions from retrofitting pneumatics, will not have as large of an impact on ozone concentrations as reductions in NOx in a majority of the areas affected by this rule?
I'm not an expert on ozone photochemistry, so cannot speak to that.
Okay, fair enough. And one final question. Do you agree that the proposals outlined that you've endorsed are more stringent than federal law would otherwise require?
I mean, of current federal law, but there is a draft federal rule that's at the Office of Management and Budget, so can't say how it compares to the proposed rule.
Fair enough. You don't have your crystal ball. As it relates to current federal law, would you agree that it is more stringent?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Is there any other council or party with questions of Dr. Lyon? No. In that case, I will turn to questions from the board. While I'm doing that, if you're an attendee, oops, I see Ms. Katz. Ms. Katz.
Sorry, Madam Hearing Officer, my camera took a minute. I actually don't have any questions for Mr. Lyon, but I think maybe Mr. Curtis might have said that ERG used 3.5 emission factor, or we used a 13.5, or sorry, we used a 3.5, but we used 13.5. So anyway, I was just trying to correct that ERG did not use 3.5.
I apologize. You're correct. I meant to simply say that Fowler used 3.5. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I thought you were probably just misspeaking. I just wanted to correct that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katz. I'm going to turn to questions from the board. If you're an attendee on the platform and have a question, reach out through the chat. Madam Chair, any questions of Dr. Lyon?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, and I just wanted to thank Dr. Lyon for his testimony and the information he's provided, but I don't have any questions at this time.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions, and I think Mr. Heiser's co-counsel there kind of was touching on some of my questions. So first, I'd like to thank Dr. Lyons for taking the time to chat with us today. I thought some of your testimony was really enlightening. I'm curious, are there any other regulations that would require reporting failures or require frequent inspections?
From any jurisdiction or specific to New Mexico?
I'm sorry, I should be more specific. I was thinking along the federal lines.
Not that I'm aware of, because for the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, pneumatic controller emissions are just based on the emission factors, regardless of if they're functioning properly or not.
Okay, I think that's all I have here. So thank you.
Thank you. Member Cates?
No questions here. Thank you.
Member Bitzer?
No questions. Thank you.
Member Garcia?
No questions. Thank you.
And Member Honker?
No questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Parnas, will there be any redirect?
No need for redirect, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lyon, for your testimony, and thank you, Ms. Parnas. I think we'll hear from Mr. Alexander on Friday. All right, thank you. So do we move back to, because we've already heard from McCabe, do we move back to the department? Ms. Katz? Oh,
Thank you, Madam
Ms.
Hearing Officer.
Gutierrez
Yes,
on
I
the
think
screen.
there's some rebuttal from, yes, I know Ms. Gutierrez, Kinder Morgan has some. I don't know if IPA&M, they have Mr. Brown as rebuttal for this, but I don't know if they're planning to put him up.
Okay, I guess I lost the thread. I thought folks were putting on their rebuttal and rebuttal as we went along, but Ms. Gutierrez?
And Madam Hearing Officer, of course, these things happen at the most inopportune time, but my witness's computer did a forced reboot. So can I circle back with you and ping you when she's available? I sincerely apologize for that.
Yes, absolutely. I see Mr. Rose on screen. Mr. Rose?
Yes, we discussed whether Mr. Brown would be testifying. He's listed as, I think, a rebuttal in a number of areas. It relates to his testimony in section 112, which is referenced throughout the reg. So we don't intend to offer him as a witness on any of the other sections. Looks like you've muted yourself.
Miss Katz, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I think we're up then for Sir rebuttal. So I'll bring Ms. Keene and Mr. Palmer back for that. All right. So beginning with Ms. Keene. So in your previous testimony, you had discussed how Colorado has been regulating pneumatic controllers since 2009, and that this fact is part of why Colorado's approach is not appropriate for New Mexico. Does the Environmental Defense Fund's argument made by Mr. McCabe that the retrofit schedule in the department's proposal is slower than Colorado's rule take into account the higher number of controllers phased out in New Mexico compared to Colorado?
No, it does not. And as I stated previously, the department's proposal would cover many more controllers than EDF's proposal, which is based on Colorado's rule, and an extended compliance timeframe is appropriate for that very reason.
And Ms. Keene, does the joint proposal from Oxy and the environmental NGOs contain all of the necessary elements to implement their proposal in the red line that they have provided?
No, their proposal is not fully developed and is missing significant rule language that is necessary to actually implement the proposal. That includes the method to determine total historic percentage of liquids produced at facilities, in addition to the barrel of oil per day production. That wasn't specifically part of the red line strikeout, but that is contained in other parties' red line strikeout versions of the rule. And so if that concept were to be implemented in this rule, that concept as well would need to be fully fleshed out. In addition, there's the primary issue is that the full calculation itself hasn't been developed, and the methodology to determine that calculation hasn't been fully developed.
Okay, thank you. If the board were to adopt that joint proposal from the environmental NGOs and Oxy, we heard that Oxy's witness, Mr. Holderman, state that it would result in less of a burden to the department. Is that true?
No, their proposal would put a greater burden on the department than the department's current proposal. As mentioned previously, that concept has not been fully developed, and so the department would need to develop that methodology to determine the total historic percentage of liquids produced. And the proposal would prepared by other parties, which may be necessary to implement, but includes significant reporting to the department, which the department currently just would not have the resources to fully address.
And when you say the proposal from other parties, which may be necessary to implement, you mean if the board were to choose that other option instead of the one that's being proposed by the department, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm turning to Mr. Palmer. Dr. McCabe in his testimony stated that the department's cost estimate assumed partial retrofits of controllers. Is that correct?
No, it is not. In our cost spreadsheet, we manipulated some of the values in order to hit an overall target of 80% non-emitting controllers for the purposes of just estimating overall cost and emission reductions. And that required that we used a fractional value in some rows to meet that overall 80% non-emitting target. But that was sort of an industry-wide approach. It was not at a facility level. So it was not a partial retrofit.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. McCabe testified that the NMED proposal will result in slower implementation of retrofits than the joint proposal of the environmental NGOs and Oxy. Did Dr. McCabe present any data or analysis to support this assertion?
No, he did not.
And does the department agree that NMED's approach will result in slower retrofits?
No, based on the well count data in the 2020 Reducing Wells spreadsheet, which is included as NMED Exhibit 94, it appears that the department's proposal could actually result in a faster replacement of pneumatic controllers because that proposal is based on controller counts rather than liquids production. Earlier today, while considering his testimony, I prepared a slide that I can share with you based on those data that will illustrate an example. Let me bring that up. And then share my screen. It's this here. Okay, let me see if I can get rid of this here. There we go. So these are the two table ones from the two rules. The one on top here is from the joint proposal from Oxy and the environmental NGOs. The lower table is the table one from the NMED's current draft rule. And the concern expressed by Dr. McCabe was that because our timeline is extended outward, it'll mean more years of excess emissions because they won't require as many retrofits. And so what I'd like to just draw your attention to are these two circled values here as examples. So these are both May or 2027 time deadlines. And they're both within this 40 to 60% cohort who currently have non-emitting controllers. So this is 40 to 60% based on the numeric count, and this is 40 to 60% based on the production count. So I looked at the well data, and assuming that wells are directly correlated with the number of controllers, under the joint proposal, but also recognizing that some wells have much higher production than other wells. Based on this, on the joint proposal, under this deadline right here, achieving 92% production in 2027 would mean that devices at 42% of wells would be non-emitting. At this nearly the same deadline, actually January 1st, 2027, so 5 months earlier, under the NMED's proposal, 70% of wells would be non-emitting, or the controllers at 70% of wells would be non-emitting because it's number of controllers. So I think it's actually the NMED proposal certainly will not result in any slower implementation of non-emitting controllers, and in some cases it may actually be faster given the well production data, but also making some assumptions about controllers per well because we don't have data on exactly how many controllers are out there and exactly how they're distributed. But the bottom line is that the department's proposal will not result in a slower implementation, and it may actually be faster.
based on my analysis.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Palmer. So turning to IPA&M, Mr. Palmer, can you describe the impact of IPA&M's proposal to exclude low producing operators from the pneumatics requirements?
Yes, the IPA&M is referring to the Colorado Reg 7 for operators whose statewide production is less than 15 barrel of oil equivalent per well per day. In Colorado, they're exempt from the company-wide non-emitting controller program for well production facilities. And going back to the NMED exhibit that we use for the small business definition, if we look at those data, then a 15 BOE per well per day exemption, as in Colorado, it would exempt 269 out of 324 well operators who have oil production. Only 55 well operators with oil production would be subject, and also 63% of all wells, or 30,200 wells, would not be subject to the non-emitting controller requirements.
And can you describe the impact of the IPA&M's proposal to exclude well sites that have fewer than 4 controllers?
This was an item that they had in their direct. It was, but there was no supporting information provided on that, so we can't estimate what the impact would be on that. However, there are many wells with that would also be exempt from that. That's all I can really say.
Okay, and Mr. Palmer, can you, does this section, the requirements of section 121, would they apply to a small business facility as defined in the rule?
No, they would not.
Okay, thank you.
They would not have. Okay.
That is all I have.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Katz. Let me ask if there are other parties. I see Mr. Bach. Do you have questions of the department panel?
I do, Madam Hearing Officer. And would it be possible to get to pull up his screen sharing privileges? I'd like to pull up again from Dr. McCabe's presentation this morning for my question.
And can I ask you to speak up now, please? Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know why. Okay, having trouble being heard. So let me just see if I can. Oops, nope, that's not right. Okay, is that, we have the slide up there? Okay, Dr. Palmer, I guess I would start with you. So I think that you said that you didn't
sorry,
see
it's only
any...
Mr. Palmer. I'm not a doctor.
Oh, well, I would believe that you were if you told me otherwise. Mr. Palmer, I believe you just said that you didn't see any evidence that the department's program would be slower. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, that's correct. I believe the slide that you're showing now is a comparison of the numbers. These are just the targets, but I don't know, are they? But I'll let you continue.
Yeah, let me. So I think that that one point that needs to be made is that there's the wellhead count where we do have this additional complication of a different metric, but there's also a table for gathering compressor stations, which let me put this in the form of a question. Do you understand that the NMED approach and the Colorado the NMED approach has a controller count number approach for gathering compressor stations. And do you understand that that's also how Colorado does it for those facilities?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question? I'm sorry.
So the question is, do you understand that, based on your understanding of the Colorado rule, for gathering compression stations, do they use a controller count metric?
Yes.
So for those
Copy of
facilities, should it be possible to do a kind of an apples to apples comparison between the department's proposal and the Colorado rule?
Mhm.
Yes?
Yes, I would agree.
Okay. And so here, this is a slide that Dr. McKay presented earlier. Did you see when he presented this?
I did.
And at least for these facilities, would you agree that this appears to show that the Colorado rule and the proposal that clean air advocates have put forward is more stringent than the NMBD's proposal?
I would agree for gathering and boosting stations.
Right. Now, it would be now maybe we could go back to your slide. Sorry for, but
Okay. But
looking- go ahead.
let me also clarify that, please. My response, and that is that when you look at our pneumatic controller cost spreadsheet, so we have, if you look on the, well, I could share it again, and that might help you out. But
yeah, it'd be great if, okay, yeah.
Okay, let me do that because I think I'm going to respond to what you're asking about pretty quickly here. Okay, so here's our cost spreadsheet, one page of it. And these rows here are for gathering and boosting. And hide this. Okay. So we have 570 gathering and boosting sites in the Permian. We have 345 gathering and boosting sites in the San Juan. Those sites, this is the average number of devices per site at a gathering and boosting station. And this was based on the greenhouse gas reporting program. So this is the total number of controllers at gathering and boosting. In the Permian is 7,075. This is the total number of controllers in the San Juan is 4,265. Relative to well sites, these are the number of controllers at wellheads. Wellheads and tank batteries in the Permian is 26,392. This is the number of controllers at wellheads and tank batteries in the San Juan, and it's 100,819. So yes, you can compare apples to apples on the gathering and boosting, but when you get to wellheads, they account for most of these wellheads and tank batteries account for where most of your controllers are. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I'd really appreciate that. And I don't think anyone would disagree that production sites are where the primary focus is for pneumatics. But I do think that you would agree that at least for gathering and boosting stations, the department's proposal is less stringent than the proposal.
It has a longer timeline.
Longer timeline. Pull up the Word document I think you were using at the end of your testimony there.
You're talking about the.
That'd be sort of the end of your sir rebuttal.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I just wanted to make sure I am clear on what you're saying here. And recognizing that there's a lot of complexity in trying to move from one metric to the other. But in that box where you say that devices at 70% of wells are non-emitting, don't you mean that 70% of devices are not emitting?
Yes, that's correct.
So not necessarily 70% of facilities.
Correct, because it's hard to estimate actually how many devices there are per well. Because some well sites will probably have fewer controllers than others.
Right. And would you agree that under the Colorado rule, the reason why they use the liquid production metric is the idea that the more liquids are produced, the more pneumatic devices you probably have at that well? Let me ask that question slower.
Hold on.
You
Teresa?
have to please speak slower for the record. You put your head down and your volume goes down. So please speak slower and louder. Thank you.
Sure, let me re-ask that question slower and louder, if I can remember it. Is your understanding, Mr. Palmer, that the reason why Colorado used this percentage of liquid production metric is that facilities that produce more liquids generally have more pneumatics?
I'm not 100%, I'm not certain on why Colorado used that metric.
Okay, would that surprise you if we represented that as our understanding?
I mean, if you told me that was your understanding. However,
So you don't know?
I'm not sure. However, the Pennsylvania, the department's rule certainly allows operators to prioritize high production wells. As far as determining which ones they want to retrofit with non-emitting controllers.
But would you agree that this comparison is perhaps more analysis needs to go into it, since we can't say for sure whether how many wells will actually be retrofit under the department's proposal?
Well, that's what I tried to do here. But the question that we were responding to, or the statement we were responding to, was the argument that the department's rule was going to result in a lower number of retrofits or greater emissions. And I looked at the data and it doesn't necessarily indicate that.
But
So
I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether this comment in the second bubble here actually shows that, because I thought I heard you say earlier that it does not correct what it says. It's not actually that 70% of wells are non-emitting. We don't know what percent of wells would be non-emitting. We just know what percent of devices. Did I misunderstand that?
no, what I did was I looked at the wells and I ranked what I said was that if you look at let me say this. Here's another way to restate this, is that 92% of production is accounted for by 42% of wells in New Mexico. So to get to 92%, you might have to retrofit the controllers at only 42% of your wells. So therefore, the controllers at 68% of your wells don't need to be retrofit. On the same date, on the same time landmark of 2027, under the New Mexico proposal, the department's proposal, 70% of your controllers have been retrofit and only 30% have not been retrofit. So that's the point I was trying to make, is that we are targeting a higher number of controllers at the same date, and actually 5 months earlier.
So I guess what I'm trying to understand here, let me ask you a hypothetical. Would you expect a larger facility, a larger well that has more production to have more pneumatic controllers than one with less production?
I think if you talk to the industry folks, they'll probably say that, and maybe I think maybe you should ask the industry folks. My understanding is that at some sites, you may have relatively fewer controllers, but they actuate more often because there's higher throughput through that controller.
So I think that's, I think you're right. We would need more information on that. I guess what I'm trying to get at here, is it logically possible that you might have 42% of the wells in the state that have 70% of the pneumatics?
I suppose that could be true.
Is it logically
But
possible
not-
that you have? Right.
But we don't have that information.
Is it logically possible that you might have 42% of the wells, the ones that are producing the most, might have 80% of the pneumatics?
I don't have the information to answer that question.
So would you agree that more analysis would probably need to be done to actually do a comparison between the two proposals?
And Madam Hearing Officer, I believe that is the point that we were trying to say about
Yes.
Mr. McCabe's analysis. So the line of questioning is kind of just going on and on.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bach?
I mean, I don't necessarily agree. I think their point was that their proposal was stronger than ours, and it's so anyway. But if the point is that it's not known, then I accept the point.
Yeah, I believe the counter was that it was in counter to Mr. McCabe's definitive statement that ours was much slower than his proposal.
I did have one final, shifting gears, one final question. And this was actually something that Ms. Keene testified to. The question from Ms. Katz was, but I would still like that table if possible. Really hard to ask these questions without the table.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you were shifting gears.
I am shifting gears, but in a way that still having a table would still be helpful. So I believe Ms. Katz asked the question that of whether it would make sense for New Mexico to have a longer phase-in period than Colorado, given that Colorado has done more in the past. Do you remember that question, Ms. Keene?
No, that's not the question that was asked.
Oh, could you tell me what you recall the question was?
The question was, in your previous testimony, you discussed how Colorado has been regulating pneumatic controllers since 2009, and that this fact is part of why Colorado's approach is not appropriate for New Mexico. Does EDF's argument that the retrofit schedule in the department's proposal is slower than Colorado's rule take into account the higher number of controllers phased out in New Mexico compared to Colorado?
Okay, I appreciate it. That's glad to have that. So I guess my question is, if an operator are you familiar with the Colorado rule?
I'm somewhat familiar. I'm not an expert in the Colorado rule, so I can't speak to specific Colorado requirements.
To the extent you're familiar with it, do you recall that Colorado has, like the department's proposal here, a cohort where it starts at 0% prices?
That's within the context of this table. Right. So there are other regulations in place that target pneumatic controller reductions that have been in place for over a decade in Colorado. So it's not, I don't think you can make those comparisons.
But there is still, as part of the new Colorado rule, is there not a percentage increase requirement for operators that start between 0 and 20%?
That's what that I believe that's true, but I don't know that for sure.
So if an operator is, so putting aside what Colorado has done in the past, is there a reason why you couldn't compare the obligations of an operator starting at 0% in New Mexico and an operator starting at 0% in Colorado?
You can't make that comparison because there are long-standing established regulatory requirements for controllers in New Mexico and Colorado. Excuse me.
Right, but I guess I'm trying to figure out why that's relevant if we're just looking at where you start and saying how much you have to increase from where you started.
It's relevant because they're starting at different baselines. So that is incredibly relevant. Yes, that is very important.
But for each baseline, you can say if you're starting at 60%, you have to do this in New Mexico, this in Colorado, right?
No, they've already made requirements that achieved important reductions. And so the baseline is very different between the two states.
What I guess I don't understand is this table that New Mexico has and that Colorado has, there's different obligations depending on where you start. So the baseline is already taken into account, is it not?
No, it's not taken. I mean, within Colorado's entire regulatory framework for pneumatics, it's taken into account that you can't translate that into this concept, into this table for New Mexico.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I've asked the question several times and I guess I don't understand the answer. Why someone starting at 20% in Colorado versus someone starting at 20% in New Mexico, why that comparison cannot be made. Is there any other elaboration you can give on that? Or am I not asking the question correctly?
No, I've answered the question. Their baselines are different and you can't compare where the baseline.
For an individual operator, you can't.
I believe that Ms. Keene has answered this as much as she can understand what Mr. Bach is asking.
Yeah, I think she's been trying to answer your question, Mr. Bach. And I'm wondering if you have other questions.
That's the only question, but I don't understand why it's not coming through, because I think I've asked it in a very clear way and I've not gotten an answer. But that's all right. We can move on.
All right, thank you. Any other parties or council with questions of this department panel? Just turn on your screen. I see Mr. Jano. Mr. Jano.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I have questions for Mr. Palmer, perhaps from Ms. Bisbee-Keene. Mr. Palmer, so I'm understanding correctly, I think I heard you testify that 92% of production in New Mexico is accounted for by 42% of the wells in New Mexico. Do I have that right?
That is what I estimated based on the New Mexico well data.
Okay. And were it true, and I understand there can be a difference of opinion on this, sir, but were it true that controlling the pneumatics at 42% of those wells would in fact control 92% of the pneumatic emissions, would you be fine with with that?
I don't believe you can make that connection exactly.
I appreciate that that's not your testimony. I'm asking you to bear with me as an expert in a hypothetical here, but if it were true that we could control 42% of the wells and thereby control 92% of the production and the emissions from pneumatics, you'd be okay with that, correct?
That's not my decision.
Okay. Well, it would be important to air quality if controlling 42% of those wells reduced 92% of the emissions, right?
Controlling 92% of the emissions would be great.
Okay. And if we could do that at 42% of the wells, in your own personal opinion, Mr. Palmer, would that be okay?
If that were the result, I think that would be good for air quality.
Okay. And sir, I think I further understood your testimony to say it, in essence, that you're not sure if the relationship between high producers and pneumatic emissions pans out across all producers. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I am not sure. There's, as we've heard a lot of testimony, there's a lot of uncertainty in the emissions from these controllers, and some of them have very high emissions because of malfunctions. So it's not clear to me personally whether there is a strong, I'm sure there's some relationship, but I'm not sure it's strong enough to advocate for one regulatory approach over another.
And Mr. Palmer, I think Mr. Bakke was trying to ask this question a little bit earlier, but does it stand to reason that a facility with more liquid production would have more pneumatics?
I would not be surprised if that were true. I would expect it to be true.
Okay.
And would you likely, yes, more equipment all around. Fair enough.
And would you expect at a facility that is producing more liquids that there'd be more actuation of pneumatics at such facility?
That's my understanding of how they work.
So stands to reason bigger facilities with more pneumatics would have more emissions than smaller facilities with less pneumatics, correct, Mr. Palmer?
Correct.
Okay. And you don't have any testimony on whether there's a linear relationship between the number of pneumatics and volume of production, correct?
I don't. However, still, there is a lot of testimony presented earlier about the fact that some pneumatics can account for very high emissions because of malfunctions.
Okay, in a program that would prioritize higher emissions would address that concern though, wouldn't it, sir?
Depends on what's in that program.
Okay, well, a good program like the one proposed by the NMED that requires inspections of pneumatics to determine whether they're malfunctioning, don't you think we could find the malfunctioning ones and fix them, sir?
I believe that is one of the objectives, yes.
And no one's questioning the inspection provision as it relates to pneumatics here, right, sir?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Just the timing on the retrofits, right?
That seems to be the question that was raised by Dr. McCabe was on timing, and he was saying that the department's proposal was less stringent because of the timing issue, and that is what I was responding to. I was not responding to the production issue. It was the timing issue that he had raised.
And to be clear, I'm not going to pick on you, Mr. Palmer, about the timing between the two proposals. What I'm trying to get out is what's going to be better for the environment. So if there were testimony that getting out there and concentrating on the bigger producers and the higher emissions instead of an arbitrary number like number of sites, if that were better for the environment, would you be for it, sir?
The current proposal allows operators to prioritize sites as they see fit.
But it also requires an arbitrary number of retrofits at the back end of that process, regardless of whether it achieves an emissions reduction. Correct, Mr. Palmer?
I don't believe that. I don't think it's correct to characterize that as arbitrary. I think that's a misleading word to use.
Okay, fair enough. I'll use a different word then. Sir, if we get out there and really control for the big emitters and reduce emissions from pneumatics at, say, 42% of the wells, and that achieves 92% of a reduction, what's the importance of the rest of that 58% of wells if we've really achieved the reductions needed for attainment?
I don't know. I think that goes beyond the scope of the question. That's still 8% of the emissions from pneumatics. There are flexibility provisions in this rule as well. There is the 75% threshold. If you reach 75% of pneumatics replacement, then you can stop early.
Right. Well, but that would still, I mean, in my hypothetical, sir, going from 42 to 75 means I'm still working on 33% that really don't give me a lot of bang for my buck, right?
I believe you've already asked that question.
Madam Hearing Officer, there's a lot of repetition and it's all based on hypotheticals without actual backup from any of the testimony. So I feel like this is going on and assuming a lot of things.
All right. No, I hear it. Mr. Jano, to a different point, though, we do need a break before the 5 o'clock public comment session. I'm wondering if you're about ready to wrap up or if we can just continue after public comment.
2 more questions, Madam Hearing Officer, and I promise I'll be done.
All right.
What's more important to maintaining attainment with the ozone standard? The number of wells that are controlled or the volume of emissions that are reduced?
There was plenty of testimony on the modeling and the emission reductions that were needed to meet the ozone standard. So I will ask you to refer to that testimony.
Sure. So you would agree with me, though, that attainment will be determined by how many emissions we reduce, not necessarily how many wells we control.
I believe that we will reach attainment when we have been able to reduce a certain amount of emissions. So how we get there it's up to the board.
But emissions matter, not necessarily number of wells, correct, sir?
Ultimately.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Nothing further.
All right. We do need a break. Let's come back at 5:03, please, so we can have a 15-minute break. Thank you.